Okay, good afternoon to everybody. I hope that you can all hear me clearly, and it's wonderful to have you here on this episode of the Miriam Institute webinar. And whether you're listening live or whether you're listening via our postcast or podcast, or you're listening on social media, we welcome each and every one of you here. Thank you so much for giving of your time to a subject that definitely warrants your time. I'll come to that in just a moment. But before I do, please allow me to thank, as ever I wish, Rosita Panini, our colleague, my colleague, co-founder and COO of the Miriam Institute, and our great and powerful colleague in common, Mr. Alan Langer, our international coordinator, for bringing this about. We greatly appreciate all of his efforts, and we're delighted to have a very auspicious guest. It's Brigadier General Shaul Gordon. I'm going to read you his bio in a moment, but before I get to that, please know that he is a dear friend of our organization. He's somebody who has lectured here in the United States of America in the halls of legislation. He's also lectured on the most elite law school campuses throughout the United States, and he did that with great aplomb and professionalism in 2015 during the spate of stabbing attacks that took place across the state of Israel. I'll be asking him about those experiences if time permits. And he's also someone who lectures to our delegations that we proudly bring to the state of Israel. Graduate students from all over the world, and much more. So, as I say, a wonderful guest, but I want to introduce him so you know the background that he brings to this conversation, the conversation entitled House Demolitions, Combating Domestic Terrorism Within the State of Israel. So Brigadier General Shaul Gordon has extensive experience serving in a legal capacity within the Israel National Police and the Israel Defense Forces, including holding the position of senior legal advisor to the Israeli National Police from 2006 to 2016. During that time, Brigadier General Gordon provided legal advice on several key domestic security challenges with international reverberations, including the sustained stabbing attacks of 2015 that I referenced earlier. Gordon provided legal counsel on matters such as administrative detention, rules of engagement, and house demolitions. He also served as president of the Military Court of Appeals in Judea and Samaria and the Gaza Strip from 2000 to 2006, and served as the deputy legal advisor for Judea and Samaria during the preceding 5-year period. Among other positions, General Gordon was the president of the military court in Gaza and vice president of the military court in Ramallah. He earned his law degree at the Hebrew University of Jerusalem and holds an MBA from Derby College in the great United Kingdom. And we're very honored to have you here, General Gordon. Shaul, may I call you Shaul for the purpose of this conversation?
Great, that's my name.
Thank you very, very much.
Good evening.
Now, before we get rolling with your interview, I would like Alan to just deal with the ability of people to ask questions. Alan, could you please come in and let everybody know how they can engage with us? Ladies and gentlemen, we're going to be trying to bring you in live and actually unmute your microphones if relevant. Alan, please also forward me the pre-submitted questions in writing if you would. So could you just talk everyone through how they can do that?
Absolutely. So there are two ways to ask your question. One is by hitting the Q&A button, which is at the bottom of your control panel on your computer. You will ask in the Q&A box, you'll type in your question, and it'll be submitted into the queue. The other is using the chat. If you don't have if you're using via your cell phone, you can chat. You can use the chat button and you can ask your question to me there. Just identify yourself with your name and your question, and that will be entered into the queue. And obviously the ones that were asked previously on the sign-up sheet are already in the queue.
Thank you very much, Alan. And I know that we do have a number of questions, so I look forward to receiving those from you. And as I say, ladies and gentlemen, please do monitor the call thoroughly, because if we do have occasion to unmute your microphones, we'd love you to engage directly with General Gordon. So before I come to the focus of our conversation, Shaul, how are you? How's life in Israel? And just tell us where you are, where you're based, and where you're living.
Okay, I live here in Jerusalem, and we're all with the corona, like everywhere else. And Jerusalem is rather bad regarding the number of people that were affected. But we're taking care of ourselves, and we hope that everything will be better in the future. And once again, it's a great honor to be with you here this evening here in Jerusalem, afternoon in New York. And I'm really looking forward for this webinar.
Thank you very much. And now, one of the things that I hope our discerning listeners will have immediately noticed is that you sound like an American when you speak. So give us a little bit of background about how that's come about. Tell us about your life story and your pathway briefly to the Israeli National Police.
Well, as you said, I have a slight American accent. I was born in Hartford, Connecticut, but I was 2.5 years old when my parents decided to move to Israel with the whole family, 4 children, 1 brother and 2 sisters. And since then, we live here in Jerusalem. I grew up in Jerusalem. By the way, the first time I experienced the war was when I was 8 years old. That was in 1967, the Six-Day War. I was actually on my way home from school when the Jordanians started shelling Jerusalem. My house was rather close to the house of the Prime Minister at the time. And I was running home between these bombs exploding on my right and my left, and smoke and glass shattering. So that was my first experience as an 8-year-old child. Later on, in 1973, I was already in high school. This was my second war. This was what we call the Yom Kippur War, the October 1973 war, which started with great surprise when Israel was attacked from Egypt and Syria simultaneously. And there were quite a few days of a real threat to the existence of Israel. And thank God, everything turned out at the end to be okay. It was a very rough war with many casualties, of course. And this was another experience that just prepared me for the rest of my career. Because when I became 18, of course, I was drafted to the army like any other Israeli boy. And at the time, it was clear to me, like it was clear to many other of my friends, that I will go and serve in the elite unit. And I joined the Golani Infantry Brigade. Later on, I went to officers training, and I was a platoon and later on a company commander. And in 1982, this was the first war that I experienced as an officer in the army. And of course, in between, we have all these waves of terror. Also as a child and later on as a grown-up, is something that we learn to live with. Those that live, of course, some of our friends, best friends, are not with us anymore. And this is something that we here in Israel experience, and this is something that we take with us wherever we go. It's always there in the background. And when I finished my army service, I went to law school in Hebrew U. As you said, I'm a graduate of the law school, and I worked for several years in the Attorney General's office.
You're also a Jewish boy from North America, and many of them go to law school.
Right. Yes. They say that a lawyer is a Jewish boy that cannot see blood, not even go to a doctor. So I went to law school. By the way, there are no lawyers in our family, and I hope there won't be any more either. And it was quite clear to me when I graduated law school that I'm not going into private practice. I'm not looking for a very big firm where I can make a very nice salary. I want to serve my country. I want to serve the community, make Israel a better place to live in. And that's why I went to be a prosecutor with the Attorney General's office here in Jerusalem. And later on, I was asked to take a year off from the Attorney General's office and become a military judge. This happened towards the end of the first uprising, what we call the Intifada, in 1992. There were many Palestinians that were arrested. There weren't enough military judges. And I was asked to take a year off. And this year at the end turned out to be 14 years because I stayed on both as a judge and later on as the president and chief judge in the Gaza Strip and the Military Court of Appeals in Gaza and in the West the West Bank. So And it was in 2006, yes, in 2006 that I was asked by the police commissioner to, after 7 years that I was serving as the president of the Military Court of Appeals, to join the Israeli National Police as the legal advisor. And that's what I did for the next 11 years. And here I am. Maybe one point I would like to mention, yes. When I was serving as a deputy legal advisor of the West Bank, I had the opportunity to be part of the Israeli, group that took part in the peace talks with the Palestinians. And we actually drafted the interim agreement that was signed in Washington later, 1995. So this was a very interesting experience. And in those days, we really felt that that's history in the making. Here's the peace coming. And sadly, I must say, different organizations had different plans. Hamas, for example, that started with all these suicide attacks. And this actually put aside the continuation of this interim agreement. I mean, it was signed, was implemented, but we were all hoping that there will be a continuation to the situation, and sadly that did not happen until this day.
Well, you know, Shaul, there's so much that I'd like to ask you, and I'd like to invite you now at the outset, if you're willing to come back and talk about some of those experiences, because you have such a rich background in the legal sphere and in negotiations and beyond. And if we could have you back, I'd very much like to, for the purpose of today. Well, actually, before I move on, I'd like everybody to know just the caliber and the level of service that comes from your home. Tell us a bit about your wife, just for a moment, and then we'll come to the subject.
My lovely wife, Kefet, she's also a police officer. And actually, just a few months ago, she was promoted. Today, she's also a brigadier general. We have 2 brigadier generals at home. That means that I wash the dishes. And she's the chief judge of the disciplinary court of the Israeli police. She was the chief education officer of the police for many years. And as I said, she was appointed to this new job just a few months ago, and she was promoted. And so both of us are either in the police or were in the police, in the same rank.
Wonderful. Well, we're very proud to know her as well, and we'll forever be indebted to her for bringing about our trip to the death camps actually in Poland as part of the official Israeli National Police delegation that I know all of our team and everyone we brought with us found to be a transformative event in our lives. And we hope to do that again in the near future. And that was when she was responsible for the education branch of the Israeli National Police. So a truly exceptional individual. Let's come to the matter at hand. It's a heavy subject. I want to give a little bit of context to it. But again, ladies and gentlemen, use the Q&A button at the bottom of your screens. Use the chat. And if we can unmute you and have you directly engage with General Gordon, we'll certainly do that. Weigh in, please, with any questions that you'd like to ask. And Alan, if you haven't, I see that I already have the pre-submitted question. So thank you very much. So the issue that we're talking about is house demolitions. Now, this was a policy, a legal policy, and also a policy of the Israeli government that shot back to prominence in 2015. And it shot back to prominence in 2015 because of a spate of stabbings that took place throughout the states of Israel against innocents in what came to be known in many circles as lone wolf terror attacks. But actually, upon further study, it was anything but lone wolf attacks. There was a lot of incitement online. It seemed to be coordinated and resulted in the Israeli government working with Facebook directly at various times in order to curb that incitement and to bring that down. But it's back in the headlines again today. And as I read out the context to our listeners, I'd like to ask Alan, could you please bring up, Alan, the photograph of the soldier who was killed by way of an attack in the West Bank? His name is Amit Ben Yigal, Zichrono Livracha, of blessed memory. Alan, can you bring up that photo as I read to people exactly what took place there? So can you enlarge that, please, Alan, if possible? So on May 12th, 2020, an Israeli soldier was killed in the northern West Bank in the pre-dawn hours of Tuesday morning after being struck in the head by a large rock during an arrest raid the Israel Defense Forces said. I'm reading to you the article that came out after this soldier was struck on May 12th of this year. The soldier, Sergeant First Class Amit Ben Yigal, was a member of the Golani Reconnaissance Battalion, the brigade to which you belonged, Shaul, which was carrying out a series of 4 arrests overnight in the West Bank village of Yabed, west of Jenin, IDF spokesperson told reporters. According to some media reports, a preliminary army probe showed the assailant had waited for the soldier to lift his head to look up before the rock was hurled at him. Ben Yigal received treatment from medics at the scene before being taken by helicopter to Haifa's Rambam Medical Center, where he was pronounced dead. Now, that resulted in a statement from the Prime Minister, who expressed the following. As has happened in every case in recent years, the long arm of Israel will reach the terrorist and settle the score. Ben Yigal's death came 2 years after IDF soldier Ronen Lubalski was killed when he too was struck on the head by a marble slab that was thrown at him. Now, the call, Shaul, after the killing of this young soldier was for the home of the terrorist to be destroyed. And on Monday, August 10th, and again, this is for the context of the people who are listening to this subject, on Monday, August the 10th, following the attack that took place on May the 12th, the High Court of Justice of the State of Israel halted the IDF's planned demolition of the home of Palestinian Nizmi Abu Bakr, who was indicted for killing Amit Ben Yigal, the individual that those of you who are watching can see now on your screen, by dropping a cinder block on his head. The 2-1 decision to overturn the demolition order had the support of Justices Meni Mazuz and George Kara. The demolition would have rendered homeless Abu Bakr's wife and 8 children who were not connected to the attack in any way, according to both justices. They said that it should be satisfactory to seal the room Abu Bakr inhabited within that home, as opposed to demolishing the home that houses now 9 people. The wife and children, in the words of the justices who overturned the decision for destruction, were not attributed by the claimants to any involvement in the criminal actions of the father, not in any form of assistance, knowledge of intention that the action would take place. Now, here's where the politicians and the Prime Minister and Deputy Prime Minister weighed in, and then I'll come to you for some clarification on this issue, because it's important that people know as we talk through this subject, there's the legal aspect of house demolitions, and then there's the policy aspect of the house demolitions. And you have expressed comfort with one, discomfort with another, and I want you to explain the two. But here's what the response was from Israeli policymakers. Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu and alternate Prime Minister and Defense Minister Benny Gantz said they would appeal the ruling. Prime Minister Netanyahu wrote on Twitter, "This is an unfortunate decision by the High Court that refused our request to demolish the house of the terrorist who murdered the late IDF soldier Amit Ben Yigal, who was the only son of his parents. I demand to establish proceedings with an expanded panel of judges. Terrorism must not be allowed to prevail. My policy as Prime Minister is to destroy the homes of terrorists, and I intend to continue to do so." Benny Gantz tweeted, "Of course, we respect any ruling of the High Court, but the ruling that revoked the order to demolish the house of the terrorist who killed the late Amit Ben Yigal is unfortunate. Home demolitions form a deterrence and they are an important tool in the war on terrorism. Therefore, I instructed staff in the Defense Ministry to contact the Attorney General to submit a request for another hearing on the ruling." Last point. The father of the soldier who was killed, Baruch Ben Yigal, burst into tears upon hearing the verdict. According to reports, he lowered the Israeli flag to half-mast. He told Channel 13 News, "This is not a good day for the state of Israel." So, Alan, you can remove that photograph if you would and bring us back to full screen. Shaul, tell us about the legal aspect of demolishing the homes of terrorists. Tell us where that comes from, the background of it, and then sequentially, I'd like to move into the policy complications and the attitudes towards deploying that.
I think actually there are four basic topics that I think we should try and cover. First of all is, of course, the legal aspects, and that's what I will do immediately. Second one are some practical things that we have to talk about when we talk about house demolition. The third one is the question if these demolitions, house demolitions, are effective, yes or not. And the fourth, assuming that this measure is effective, is what are the consequences of doing such an act on matters of cost and benefit considerations, because it's a very problematic one. And then I think we will be able to talk about this specific case that was brought up to the Supreme Court, the High Court of Justice. Well, when we're talking about the legal aspects of house demolition, we have to first of all remember this is not an Israeli invention. It was enacted by the British mandate way back in 1945, actually a little bit even before, but the wording that we use today is what we call Article 119 of the emergency regulations that were enacted, as I said, in 1945 by the British mandate. According to this Article 119, the military commander has the power to demolish the house of any person who was involved in violence or even an attempt to be involved in such an act, or assisting someone who was involved in such an act. And he has the power not only to destroy and demolish his house, he can demolish the whole street, the whole neighborhood, the whole village, the whole town. Well, this is something really, it's hard to believe that this is something that is something that we can do from a legal point of view. But these are the words of Article 119 of the Emergency Regulations of 1945. What happened was that it was hardly used it was used in several cases by the British mandate. In as I said, it was enacted in 1945. In 1946, Jordan got its independence. Now, Jordan was the east bank of the Jordan River. The mandate was on both sides, of course, the east and the west bank. And Jordan got its independence in 1946. They did not have any rules prepared in advance. And to continue living and having a normal system, they continued applying the British laws that were enforced the eve of Jordan's independence. So that's how Article 119 exists till this day in Jordan. Something very similar happened in Israel in 1948 when Israel got its independence. We had no laws prepared in advance either. So we took the British laws and we continued enforcing them, announcing that in the future we can replace these laws, we can amend them, but for the first years and until not many years ago, we still had British laws here in Israel. Article 119 is one of them, and it exists till this day because it was not changed or amended. When Israel entered the West Bank in 1967, Israel was obligated, according to international law, and I'm referring to Article 43 of the Hague Convention, which states that the occupier, in this case Israel, must continue applying the law that was enforcing the law that was applied but in that country before this occupier entered the territory. And when we enter the West Bank in 1967, we of course meet once again this Article 119 because it's part of the Jordanian law. So actually, from a legal point of view, today in the West Bank, we have Article 119 that we inherited from the Jordanians. When you're talking about terror attacks inside Israel, we meet Article 119, the same words exactly. This time, we inherited from the British mandate in 1948. So as I said, this is the legal situation. And of course, we say that we demolish houses not to punish, because usually the terrorist that was involved in this terror attack, in most cases he was either killed. Sometimes we're talking about suicide attackers. Sometimes he was shot while he was trying to take part in take this action out. And in some cases, yes, he, like in this last case of Abu Bakr that you just mentioned, he was arrested, was brought to trial. But we say that we demolish houses as a preventive act. We're trying to deter people, potential terrorists, from taking part in any terror attack. Of course, we use this tool only against the house that was used by the terrorist, not by any other families or neighbors. Of course, not the whole street, not the whole neighborhood, only the house itself. And if it happens to be that in this house there's several families that live in, of course, by demolishing his house of this terrorist, we will affect the neighbors as well, other families. Then we will just seal down his house and leave the rest, the other apartments that can be used by their owners.
Just for the listeners, the sealing of the home to avoid collateral damage or damage to the surroundings of other people's homes, that typically takes place by way of filling the home with concrete.
With cement, right?
Exactly. Yeah.
Right. Cement. Sometimes it would be just by, with metal pieces. Like that. Usually, it's done by cement. You pour cement into this apartment, and then it cannot be used again. It's important that everybody should understand that when the military commander decides to use this tool of demolishing a house, he will first of all inform the family that he's planning to do so. And after he informs them, they have the right to appeal to the military commander and to try and convince him to change his decision. If he decides, nevertheless, to continue and demolish this house, they will have time to appeal to the High Court of Justice, which in Israel is the Supreme Court. Try and imagine that each and every family that their house is going to be demolished has the right to go to the Supreme Court of the United States. Okay? And as a matter of fact, almost 100% of these houses that were demolished, the families did go to the High Court of Justice and appealed against this decision. It's important to know that we're not talking about hundreds or thousands of houses. People don't really know the numbers. I can tell you in the last, I think since 2015, there were some close to 45 or 50 houses that were demolished, sealed off. These are the numbers. And the military commander will usually decide, will make such a decision only when the terror attack resulted with the death of people. If someone was just injured, for example, the house will not be demolished. So we're only talking about the the most serious terror cases. And once again, the purpose is to try and deter other potential terrorists from to be involved in such terror attack. In most cases, the Supreme Court, the High Court of Justice, has decided that from a legal point of view, from the reasons that I just stated, from a legal point of view, the act of demolishing houses is legal. Although it does have a certain effect of collective punishment, because at the end, it affects mostly the family of the terrorist. The terrorist himself will, if he's still alive, if he didn't blow himself up in a suicide attack, for example, he will probably be in the prison for many, many years. Those that will be affected by this act are his wife, his children, his parents sometimes. And it does seem like collective punishment, but the purpose is to deter, and the High Court of Justice says that this is a good reason. they say that they have nothing to do with the policy. Even if they think it's wrong, it's not for them to decide. This is something that the government has to decide. They're only dealing with the legal aspects.
Shaul, there are two things before you move on that I'd like to, well, three things. Firstly, I know our audience is a sophisticated audience, and therefore when they hear terms like occupied, they understand the context out of which you're speaking about. So when you speak about Israel inside Judea, Samaria, the West Bank, you're talking about the fact that there's a military presence there after the Six-Day War. You're not talking about the political associations of this word that's a buzzword all over the world at the moment. I just want people to understand that. I don't want you to be branded one way or the other. This is a talk about the legalities. The second thing that I wanted to say is that I wanted you just quickly, very quickly, before you move on, to talk about this incredible thing that you've referenced, which is the ability of a Palestinian Arab in Judea Samaria to petition the Supreme Court of the State of Israel. Just talk about the access they have. That oftentimes goes over people's heads, but I think it bears being mentioned. If you could just briefly.
Yeah. Well, from a legal point of view, the West Bank, Judea and Samaria are not part of Israel. According to international law, this is an occupied territory, and there's special rules that are applied according to international law. Therefore, theoretically, no Palestinian has the right to approach the Israeli High Court of Justice. This is something that is meant only for the people living in Israel. When the first appeal was brought in front of the Israeli High Court of Justice, the Attorney General was debating if to claim that the Palestinian has no right to approach the Israeli High Court of Justice. There was a whole debate on that matter, and the decision was that Israel, although from a pure legal point of view, there's no right for a Palestinian to approach the Israeli High Court of Justice, the state will not claim this, will not say this, and therefore, if nobody claims that he has no right to go to approach the Israeli court, then of course the court will deal with this case. This was decided somewhere in the 70s. That was the first appeal to the High Court of Justice, and since then, it's something that it's common knowledge that Palestinians do have the right, actually, to approach the Israeli High Court of Justice.
I think that's really important. It's so vital that people realize that there is full legal recourse available to the Palestinians, up to and including the Supreme Court. The other thing that I wanted to ask you to just clarify before you move on is why it's a deterrent. Because it's not just a deterrent, house demolitions, because it's unpleasant to have one's home demolished. It's also a consequence of the financial compensation and, frankly, rewards that are afforded and given and granted by the Palestinian Authority and others to those families left behind by a terrorist who has killed an innocent Israeli. Talk a bit about that.
Well, that's exactly, this is something I was exactly planning to talk about. That's the question, if it's effective. These demolitions are effective. And this, of course, it makes a big difference. I mean, if someone really loses his house, or if someone will build a new house for him, then of course, it's maybe not comfortable for them in the meantime until they build a new house. But the question is if it's really, if it will deter someone from taking part in a terror attack is a question that we have to ask ourselves. So the first thing is really, when we ask ourselves if demolishing houses is something that's effective, the true answer is that we don't know. And the reason we don't know is because we don't know how many terror attacks we prevented. We know how many houses we demolished. We know how many terror attacks took place. We don't know how many terror attacks we prevented. And this is something that you have to guess. But we have, on one hand, we know of several, and I even met or read things that some terrorists wrote, that they were planning to take part in a suicide attack or some kind of a terror attack, and at the last moment they decided not to do it because they felt very bad for their family that they will have to leave their home and will be thrown out on the streets, and that made them change their decision. We even know of one case where a father went into the police and told the police that his son is planning a terror attack, and he wants them to go and arrest him because he was afraid that if his son will take part in this terror attack, his house will be demolished. So on one hand, we know that there were several cases where it was definitely effective. But the question is this most of the cases, or this is only a small part of it? And we don't know. We know that although we think we're deterring potential terrorists, we still know that there are hundreds and thousands of terror attacks that take place. So perhaps it's not effective. And if we're thinking of people that are willing to commit suicide, to blow themselves up in a bus in Jerusalem or Tel Aviv or anywhere else, then you really think that blowing up their house and sending their family to find a new place, this is something that will deter them from taking part in this terror attack? It's a big question, and as I said, we don't really know the answer. And therefore, in 2004, the IDF decided to appoint a special committee which was asked to answer this specific question. Are we effective? Is this measure effective or not? And as I said, there was not a clear answer, but there were signs or things that were said by this committee that show that perhaps there's more damage caused by these house demolitions than benefits, and this is something that we really have to reconsider, because for many years it was common knowledge. All Israeli governments in the past thought that it is effective. That's why they continued doing it for many years. The first time that really this thing was brought and thought through seriously was in 2004. We have to understand that demolishing houses, even if it is legal, it's okay from a legal point of view. And even if we think that it's effective, and we're not sure, but let's assume that it is effective, we know that it definitely has an impact on the international public opinion, on the image of Israel. And there's a lot of criticism by lawyers, judges, and the international community in large. There's a lot of criticism against Israel, and therefore we have to think and reconsider the use of this measure. Therefore, the Israeli government decided in 2005, this was after several years of very bad suicide attacks that took place in the beginning of the 2000s, 2002, 2003. By 2005, things were quite down, and the Israeli government decided that because of the damage that it's causing Israel's image in the world and in Israel as well, they will stop using. They won't decide to delete this Article 119 from the law books, but they will not be used unless the situation, the circumstances will change in such a way that we'll consider using them once again. And this policy lasted for 10 years, from 2005 till 2015. As you mentioned, 2015, we started with all these stabbing attacks, these lone attackers. And the problem with these attacks is that people, when it's try to imitate what they see their friends, families, other people doing. So if you have one or two or three people stabbing, in a few weeks you'll have hundreds, and you have to stop this wave, this terror wave. And one of the ways that the Israeli government thought would be effective was to reuse this measure of demolishing housing. So actually for 10 years it wasn't used, and because of the circumstances, they decided to use it once again. And from then, since not 2015 till these days, it's used, not in large numbers. As I said, since the beginning, since 2015 till these days, I think there were some 45 or 50 houses that were demolished, sealed off. Sometimes it's a room, sometimes it's a whole floor, sometimes it's a whole building. But I said, only if it won't affect neighbors that are not part of the family. And now we go over to the decision that you mentioned, the decision of this terrorist. Abu Bakr is his name. He's, by the way, he's a person of 49 years old, married with 8 children, as you said. And two of the judges.
This is the individual who killed the IDF soldier by way of dropping us in the block.
Right. They dropped a rock. By the way, it was something that weighed some 22 pounds, 10 kilos, it's 22 pounds. It's really something dreadful. And
I'm sorry to break your train of thought, but I really want to emphasize that to people. It's so important because I was not aware of the weight of that. But I remember working and operating in Hebron, for example, Ben Asimtaot, between the thoroughfares there in the marketplace, and always having to look and cover the roof for the possibility that a cinder block or a rock or a washing machine or anything could be dropped on our heads as we moved and patrolled and operated there. And there's this understanding, you've referenced it, our image overseas several times here. There's this false understanding or false presumption that we're operating with, in my days it was M16s, and the people that we're operating against are armed only with pebbles and tiny stones. But I want our audience to understand that what you've just said, make no mistake about it, describes a deadly weapon launched with murderous intent. A 22-pound cinder block dropped from on high will kill an individual.
It can't be even thrown. It's so heavy you can't throw it. Just drop it from the roof on the heads of the soldiers that are on the street. So in this case, the military commander, as you mentioned, decided to demolish the house. The family approached the military commander. He decided not to change his decision. It was brought to the High Court of Justice, and these two judges decided that this decision of the military commander is wrong for the reason that the family, the wife and 8 children, had no knowledge of what this Abu Bakr was planning to do, and they are actually the only ones that are going to pay the price. They will actually be punished. Now, it's important to understand that this argument was actually true, I think, in perhaps 95% of the houses, or cases of demolishing houses. It's usually the one member of the family that took part in the terror attack. The family usually has no idea, no knowledge of what their family member is planning to do. And of course, they had no intent, they weren't involved in any such way in this terror attack. So it's not something different than what we knew in hundreds of cases along the years. But I think these two judges were trying to say that they think that it's a wrong measure. They can't attack it from a legal point of view because we said from a strict legal point of view, it's legal. If we like it or not, it's legal. Is it right to do it or is it wrong? This is a matter of policy, and I think policy should be decided by the government, not by judges. And I'll say in a few minutes my personal idea, but as I say, as a judge, I think we have to look into the legal aspects and decide, does the government have the power to decide? Does the military commander have the power to decide? And the answer is yes. If we like it or not, it's their responsibility to ensure the security of the population, of the soldiers, and they have to take the right measures. Is this a right measure or not? This is something that they have to think about and they have to decide. They did it in 2005. They decided that it's something that they don't want to use. 2015, they decided to use it once again. This is their responsibility. It's their authority, and it's not the authority of the Supreme Court. And this is actually what the third judge thought should be the right decision. And as you mentioned, the minister of the government has actually decided to appeal for another hearing. This time with a larger number of judges, with a 3-panel judge. So next time maybe it will be 5-panel judge, and maybe the decision will be different. I don't think the problem is this specific case. I think we should be talking about house demolitions in general. Is this a right thing to do or a wrong thing to do? And I said it was a clear case. I think everybody would know what the right answer is. And I can tell you, I don't know what the right answer is either. But personally, I can tell you that I think that it's, as much as we can say that from a strict legal point of view, it's okay, it's right. I think it's really collective punishment. You're actually punishing the family, and in Judaism, we usually say that each one should pay the price for the crimes that he committed, not his family. And I think this is true also when we're talking about Palestinians. I don't think that the family in this case or in other cases should pay the price. And if the person is alive, he will be brought to trial. He will serve his time in prison. If he's dead, then he's dead, and there's nothing we can do about it. Very different, by the way, than administrative detention. And if we have maybe sometime in the future, you would like to talk about administrative detention, we can do that. Administrative detention is a different story completely. It's really preventive. We know it, as a matter of fact. It really prevents terror attacks, and it's legal according to international law. Demolishing houses is not legal according to international law. It's legal because the British mandate enacted this Article 119, and it exists till this day in Israel and in Jordan and in the West Bank. But I think it's very, very problematic from a legal point of view, and mostly because the impact that it has on the image of Israel in the international community. I think it's something that we really have to consider. On the other hand, we have to understand that Israel has to find measures with which she can deter potential terrorists. Are there other methods, other means that she can use? This is a very, very difficult question. No doubt that demolishing houses is an easy one. It's an easy one because everybody sees it, everybody knows. And even if we're not sure that it's effective, it's something that was done for many years and we're still doing it. So this is where it stands right now, and we'll see what the Supreme Court will decide in the next hearing.
So I actually have about 15 more minutes of my questions, and then I'm going to open it to audience questions, if that's okay with you, Shaul. And I would like to bring you back on to talk about administrative detention. And I really appreciate you giving your personal viewpoint, not only looking at this policy, giving such a clear legal assessment of it, establishing the fact that it is a legal policy, but it's also a problematic policy, and not only poking holes in the policy, but actually suggesting that we need to look at it much more broadly. I very much appreciate you stepping into the fray and doing that, and bringing all of the weight of your legal background to bear when you do so. I would like to just tell people how live this is, and then I'm going to switch gears. I want to give a heads up, by the way. We plan on reading a few questions. You've dealt with so many of the pre-submitted questions, but I'm going to read out a question from David in a few minutes. And also, we'd like Mindy, when we call on you, we'd like to know that you can unmute and ask your question directly of the General. That's in a few moments. So ladies and gentlemen, this subject of the destruction of homes is still so very live. On Wednesday, August the 26th, less than a week ago, a Palestinian suspect was arrested after allegedly stabbing and killing Shai Ohayan, 39 years of age, at the Segula junction in Petah Tikva. The background of the incident is still being investigated, but Israeli police say that it is being looked into as an act of terror. To give you a bit of context about that, ladies and gentlemen, this is a quote from Magen David Adom, who arrived at the scene. They said, quote, "We found the victim laid out next to a bus with no pulse, not breathing, and with multiple stab wounds to his upper torso." Now, again, a little bit about the victim. It was Rabbi Shai Ohayan, as already mentioned. He was a prominent figure in his neighborhood, and according to his neighbors, was always offering Torah lessons to anyone who was interested. He leaves behind a wife and 4 children. And Netanyahu, Prime Minister Netanyahu, weighed in, and he said, "On behalf of all Israeli citizens, I send my deepest condolences to the family The heart aches. My wife, Sarah, and I are hugging the family, a wife and 4 children who are left without a father. And then he goes on in a tweet and he says, quote, "We will demolish the terrorist house and work for carrying out the most severe punishment possible." So I'm not necessarily speaking to that for a response, because I think you've contextualized that extremely well. But I do want everybody to realize that this is a policy that is controversial, legal, has many, many difficulties attached to and assigned to it, and not an easy one to explain and express to audiences overseas. And I thank you for doing that. Now, in 2015, during the stabbing attacks, or it may have been in 2016, Shaul, as you've mentioned earlier in this conversation, the idea of home demolitions came back. And it came back because of this dreadful spate of indiscriminate stabbings that were so prevalent that they were actually nicknamed by some as being a stabbing intifada, a stabbing uprising. There are different views about that term, incidentally. And we in our organization brought you as the then senior legal advisor to the Israeli National Police, and you undertook, and I referenced this earlier in our discussion today, you undertook a lecture series that dealt with 3 issues: house demolitions, administrative detention, and the discharge of a live firearm in the face of stabbing attacks. You undertook that lecture series in, and I think I remember correctly, among others, Harvard Law School, in front of the pro, the anti, the undecided elements of the students and faculty community alike, Columbia University Law School, University of Chicago Law School, Georgetown Law Center. You also spoke to elected officials in the House and in the Senate, and also to now Secretary of State Mike Pompeo. You spoke to Hill staffers on a bicameral, bipartisan basis, and you really front-loaded these difficult issues. If I'm not mistaken, you also spoke in the University of California, Los Angeles Law School, and also one of the universities in San Diego, one of the law schools there. You did all of that, by the way, in case the audience is wondering. You did all of that in a period of about 10 days, all right? And there were more. There were others. You spoke at law firms. You really got the message out. Now, I want to ask you, in your words, 2 questions about that. When you were first approached by us to come and speak and to bring, remember, you're addressing keen legal minds at the preeminent law schools on a subject that's controversial for the reasons you've already outlined, and you decided to say yes. Question number 1, why did you decide to bring that case abroad as you did? And question number 2, how did you view the response of both the students, the graduate students, and the elected officials? And you briefed, remember, both sides of the political aisle on this issue.
Well, first of all, it was clear to me that the public all around the world, I think people don't really know what's happening here. I think that just watching the TV, the media, people don't get a right perspective of what's going on here. And I think it's important they hear it from someone that's living there and sees it on a daily basis. And as a police officer, I not only hear of it, in some cases I was even involved personally in a terror attack that happened just not far from my house. And this is something I can tell them in my own words. And I think it's very important that they hear it. And the second reason would be that they should understand the complexity of the legal aspects. It's not, there are other countries that are dealing with terror. And the way they deal with terror, I don't think that we would like to be similar to them. Israel is a democracy, and we live according to the law. And we have our court system, and we obey the decisions of the Supreme Court. And it was very important that they understand the legal complexity and the way that we're trying to deal with it. On the one hand, we're trying to deal with terror. We're dealing with people that have no respect to the law whatsoever, not to the rules of engagement, not to not to lives of people, of children, of older women and men. They have no respect to none of these. But nevertheless, we as a country, as a democracy, will continue working according to the law. And we have to find the special ways to do it. And as I said before, we were talking about demolishing houses. We have to think of ways to deter these potential terrorists. We can't do everything. Not everything that we can think of is legal, is right, is justice to do, just to do. We have to think of legal methods. And but it was very important for me to bring it to these judges and lawyers and all these law schools students, that they should understand that we're trying to find the right way to deal with terror. And when I go over to your second question, I really felt that people went up to me later after I finished my lecture, and they said, I had no idea that this is the situation, or until I heard your lecture, I didn't understand how complicated the situation is, and what are you really trying to do in order to act according to the law. Although these terrorists have no respect for the law, nevertheless, you are still trying to find the lawful way to deal with terror. And I think it changed their point of view, even if they didn't agree with us. Some of them said, we still think that demolishing houses is wrong. It's legitimate. I said I think it's problematic as well. But it was important that they understand that we're not just doing it, we're thinking, and we're aware of the legal problems, and we're trying to find solutions for these situations.
And if you would, just before I move on from that point, by the way, you just answer the question, because it's an interesting topic that's timely now. You did brief members of the House as well and the Senate, Democrats and Republicans. How did you take those meetings to be?
Well, I think what happened on the campuses was actually very similar to what we heard. There's opinions from this side, on that side, but I was really, it was very interesting that, first of all, people wanted to listen. That's the first thing. We wanted to talk, we wanted to explain, we wanted to share our feelings, our thoughts, and they were willing to hear. That was very, very important. They can agree, they can disagree, but they had the willingness to listen. And that's, I think, the basis for everything we do, is to listen to each other and not be sure that we know all the answers. We're always willing to hear other people.
And last point about that, about your tour, just so our listeners know, because several of them are very engaged with the work that we do. Describe, if you would, visually, Harvard Law School. You remember we walked in there. Tell us what you saw from the podium, and then tell us about the conduct of those students, those law students there.
Well, it was an open lecture. All law students could attend this lecture, and the hall was full from side to side. But in the back row, there were several students, definitely Palestinians, or they were wearing these what we call galabia or kafia on their heads. And they were holding signs. It seems that according to the regulations of the Harvard Law School regulations, they cannot disturb, they cannot shout, they cannot demonstrate, but they can hold signs. And these signs were saying that Israel, there's apartheid in Israel, that Israel is not a democracy, that Israel is doing crimes against humanity. And I saw these signs. I know that there were cases where students were even shouting or trying to disturb. Here they didn't do it because these are the regulations of the law school. And I think that was fine with me. And some of them remained, they listened to the whole lecture. Some of them left. They put up their signs, and after 10 minutes, they left the room. Those that did remain, when I took the questions from the audience, I specifically wanted to hear their questions, because I wanted them to express their feelings and their thoughts, and I want them to listen to mine. And so that was a very interesting experience, I must say.
Yeah, and of course, I don't know what the regulations are at the law school. You know it better than I do, it seems. But the point of the matter is that you went there, a legal expert, dealing in the implementation of the policy about which you were speaking.
In uniform, by the way, just to remind you, I was in police uniform.
You were in full dress uniform, And those students did hold up those signs, and as some of them, a very small number, left the room. But the point I want to get across is when you bring appropriate expertise from the State of Israel to front load and tackle the most difficult and complicated subjects, you can have a beneficial, productive, and even opinion-altering conversation with even the most adversarial of students. And I think what you've just said about the similarity between your experience on the campuses and your experience in the Congress is very, very instructive for all listeners, because the students of today, as we always say, will be the policymakers of tomorrow. And the attitudes that are placed there on campus will seep into legislative office. And so it's so important to continue with this work. And I just wanted people to hear from you, not from us, about the positive aspects of your lecture and engagement there on campuses. I'm going to, as I said, there are so many questions here. You've answered most of them in the body of your talk, but Alan, I'd like you to bring in Mindy. Now, before you unmute Mindy, I just want to establish the rules here for the questions. We take one question, one answer, no follow-up questions. We assign 15 seconds for the questioner to ask the question. And we ask, please, no speeches disguised as questions. So if you could kindly unmute Mindy. I think Mindy actually, the reason I want her to weigh in is she raised an issue that's very, very interesting to me. I haven't had the opportunity to discuss with you, and it rolls nicely from what you said about reevaluating the policy. Alan, if you could bring in Mindy to ask a question, please.
Okay, can you hear me? Yes.
We hear you, Mindy. 15 seconds, and thank you so much for your question. I think it's a fascinating one.
Is it possible to deport the family since they just rebuild the house anyway?
Mindy, can you repeat that, because your sound just went?
Okay. Is it possible to deport the family instead? Wouldn't that be much more effective than house demolitions since they just rebuild the house anyway?
Thank you very much, Mindy. So, Shaul, if you can address yourself to the idea of deportation. It's not actually a new idea, this idea of deporting terrorists, but contextualize it within the family, not
right.
the terrorist.
Right. Deportation is really problematic. If we said that demolishing houses is problematic, then deportation is really problematic. It was done in the past, and the High Court of Justice decided that it cannot be, you cannot deport a family from its home. You can demolish their house, but you cannot deport them. It was done in the past, but today I don't think there's any chance that it would stand in the Supreme Court. And so therefore, they did it with several terrorists that some of them agreed to be deported from the West Bank to Gaza or to Lebanon. And by the way, some of them just became more exports in the terror. They came back from Lebanon as real big terrorists when they just started, when they were deported as, you know, something rather low in the rank. And so I don't think it was really effective at the time when it was done.
Thank you, Shaul. In a moment, I'm going to come to Ron. Ron also put in a question. Alan, if you can ready to unmute Ron. But before I do that, I want to go to one of the questions by an adjunct of the Miriam Institute. He's actually a graduate of Harvard Law School. And he pre-submitted a question, and he says, on a slightly different subject, several American police forces have been under fire recently for use of excessively forceful techniques. Shaul, he's referring here, I assume, to among others, the George Floyd incident, the George Floyd death that came about some months ago. And he goes on to say, anti-Israel propagandists have laid the blame for this excessive force at the feet of the Israeli-American police cooperation. Can you describe the nature of that cooperation and what the two police systems have learned from one another? I would like to go a bit beyond that. I'd like you to contextualize and address yourself to whether or not you think Israel should in any way, shape or form be blamed for these terrible acts that we've seen.
Well, there is a matter of cooperation, of course, between the Israeli police and the American police regarding terror. in that trip that we had in 2015 or 16, we met the commissioner of the NYPD, and Israel has very good relations with the police commissioners all over the world. And we share knowledge and techniques with mostly what has to do with terror, not so much regular crimes, but terror. And I don't think that there's any, to the best of my knowledge, I don't think there's any ground for this accusation. Israel has no connection with the American police regarding how you arrest a person, if you can put your leg on his throat, yes or not, and other methods, other techniques. I don't think Israel really has anything to do with that. That the fact that people who are always trying to blame Israel, I think there is some kind of connection. That's one thing, but I don't think that, as a matter of fact, there's any basis, any grounds for this accusation.
Thank you very much, Shaul, for answering that. I just want to weigh in on that and to let everybody know, again, when I was operating with the Israel Defense Forces as part of my service in various deployments, there were times when somebody needed to be apprehended. I've already spoken, or Shaul's really spoken more effectively about the deadly nature of the weapons wielded against soldiers by Palestinian Arabs who mean us harm, and who oftentimes wield those weapons, or sometimes wield those weapons with intent to kill. Now, you are by definition outnumbered as a soldier of the IDF when you're operating in these places. You might not be outgunned, but you are outnumbered, certainly. And there were several occasions where I had to make an arrest. There were too many people around us. We were trained and taught in that situation, this is a military situation, that in the absence of any other option, you could restrain somebody by placing them face down on the ground. And if you needed to place your knee on the head, on the side of the head, that would restrain the individual. But never, never, never were you permitted, shown, taught, or would you have been excused for placing your knee on the neck, the throat of an individual. And you were only to do the measure that I spoke about for as long as it took you to then remove the restraints from your equipment vest, handcuff the individual, and turn that individual over to the authorities. Now, it's not a pleasant position, but it's certainly not a deadly position, and it's only an option of last resort, really of last resort. And that's the military. That's not the police force, and that's dealing with acts of terror and so on and so forth. So I just want to draw that distinction. If you look at the pictures that are circulated by these propagandists that David references in his question, you do not see IDF soldiers with their knees on the necks of detainees. You see them with their knees on the side of the head of a detainee, and it's actually one of the more humane measures that one can undertake, because it's another measure, another step to prevent the deployment of live fire or tear gas or any other such thing, or even rubber bullets, which are non-lethal but can have lethal consequences if they hit the wrong part of the body. So I just wanted to mention that. And Shaul, thank you for explaining the limitations of the exchange between the Israeli National Police and police forces in the United States. And also thank you for reminding us that, yes, you absolutely did go and brief the NYPD in the Situation Room with then Commissioner Bill Bratton. And that was an incredible, incredible meeting. He sat with us for over an hour, I remember, as you briefed him and talked him through this lone wolf phenomenon. And why did he give us that time? And why did you want to give of your time? Because there was a fear of lone wolf attacks in the United States at that time. Do you remember?
Definitely.
You remember that was the reason for it? That was one of the reasons?
Yes, and they wanted to learn from our experience. And I think originally we had less than half an hour that we were supposed to talk for about a half an hour, and it turned out closer to an hour and a quarter. And even then we had to stop because he had some kind of a meeting. If not, we would continue talking about it. Yes, it was very interesting. And he was very interested in what we're doing in Israel in order to confront terror with legal measures, as I said.
So, Shaul, we're going to take one last audience question if the individual's ready. It's Ron. Alan, I'd like to ask you to unmute Ron, and then I'm going to conclude with another point quickly. I see you've also unmuted somebody else, Alan. So just Ron to unmute, please. And Ron, if you have a question to ask, please ask it. 15 seconds to ask the question that you submitted to us, if you would.
Thank you. This is a question, General. If you would expand on your comments concerning the Supreme Court rulings that limit actions of the military in the areas and government itself in all of Israel.
Okay, if I understand your question, well, this is part of living in a democratic country. The court makes its decisions and everybody obeys. It's the government and it's the military commander. Of course, it's their responsibility, and therefore the courts are usually very, very careful. They will say if it's legal or not. They will say we won't say what our opinion is, if it's the right thing to do, because it's not our responsibility. We will just examine very carefully if it's legal or not legal. That's what actually happened in this last case of Abu Bakr. Some may say that the court went one step too far, and that we'll see, of course, in the next hearing. But in the past, at least, we knew from many cases the court wasn't very pleased with these house demolitions, but nevertheless they approved and they said that it's okay from a legal point of view. And so this was actually, I would say it's probably the first time that we see a decision that's maybe moving from the legal aspect into something that's more close to policy making. And as we said, this is something that we have to leave to the government, because at the bottom line, they have the responsibility for the security of the people of Israel.
Thank you very much, Shaul. Just before we go, I wanted to ask you a number of questions about the importance of service and so forth, but I'm not going to. I'm going to, just because of the time, and I know that we have now your kind offer to come back, I'm going to ask you, there's an anecdote that you always make mention of to our audiences in Israel when you host them, about how you might bring about an end or fix a timeline to the end of the Israel-Palestinian conflict. Would you be willing to share that with our listeners just before we conclude?
Okay, so this is always a nice way to finish. Well, this is a story about Gorbachev, President Carter, and Menachem Begin, the Prime Minister of Israel, that meet God, and each one has the opportunity to ask one question. And Gorbachev walks up and says, God, will there ever be an end to communism? God says, yes, there will, but it's not going to be during your administration. Then President Carter walks up and asks, God, will there ever be an end to the Cold War? And God says, yes, my son, there will, but it's not going to be during your administration. And then Menachem Begin walks up and asks with his special voice, he says, my Lord, will there ever be an end to the Israeli-Arab conflict? And after a few seconds, God says, well, perhaps, my son, but it's not going to be during my administration. So this is a story. I took part in the peace talks with the Palestinians, and I really believed and hoped that it would be during my, not administration, but during my job as the legal advisor. And as I said, sadly, it did not happen. I believe it will happen sometime in the future. We pray for that every day, and we really hope, and we're trying to do the best in order that it will happen, but we have to be realistic. We know we're living in Israel. As I said, I experienced my first war when I was 8 years old, and it's not over yet. And we have to find the way to do it. And it will take time, it will take patience. What's happening today with the Emirates is a great blessing, and we all hope that things will move in the right direction. And perhaps it will be during our administration sometime in the near future.
Well, Shaul, thank you so very much for this. I just want to conclude by letting everybody know that what they've heard today is the voice of somebody infused with a rich legal background, a deep commitment to public service, but also Jewish values. And as I like to, Jewish values and Jewish teachings. And as I like to express to people, you know, you arranged for us to go and visit the death camps, and Rakefet arranged for us to go and visit the death camps. And it's not lost upon me, and it should not be lost upon our listeners, the fact that there are brigadiers general with Israeli names who are Jewish and who are in high ranks within the Israeli National Police, Brigadier General Shaul Gordon and Brigadier General Rakefet Gordon, who now have the opportunity not only to safeguard the people of Israel, something we couldn't have imagined some decades ago, but also to apply the best of Jewish learnings, teachings, and our ethos in order to provide the rights, the human rights, and the legal rights to people who are not of our number. And that's really a remarkable phenomenon. Rosita, Alan, we all deeply, deeply appreciate you being on here today. I want to thank everybody who's listened. I know that you've enriched my education as ever you do, and I do look forward to having you back on. And anybody who is still with us, whether you're listening on a live cast or a postcast or a podcast, please do invest in the Miriam Institute. We are bringing these conversations to the best of your students, the best of your legislators, and we're only able to do so based on your investment within our work, which you can make by way of the donate button at miriaminstitute.org. Please do invest. You will get a return on your investment by way of better informed individuals from any audience that we have the privilege of meeting and engaging with. So thank you very, very much indeed, Shaul. Please send our best and warmest regards to Brigadier General Rakefet. And Shaul, enjoy the washing up.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
All the best.
Bye-bye.